Okay, well, let's get started. Good afternoon again, everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to join today to becoming the trusted advisors that clients can't replace. As I know many of you spend your days advising business owners and leadership teams. So today is not about teaching you how to be a better consultant or a lawyer or accountant or financial advisor or even technical expert. It's about something that sits above all that you do. How do you become the advisor a client genuinely doesn't want to make an important decision without? We'll leave some time at the end for questions, so feel free to drop them in the chat as we go, and I'll do my best to figure out where those go and answer them. And lastly, we're also going to be sharing a recording of today's webinar with you for future reference, along with a complimentary download of the 21 executive questions every trusted advisor should ask. So to give you a little context, for those who don't know me or who have not met, I'm Ed D'Elia. I grew up around D'Elia Associates, which my dad founded in 1964. Helping B2B companies grow has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. I think my official first business task here at D'Elia Associates was around the age of 5. I was asked to help collate some press kits, and I think I received a Stormtrooper Star Wars toy for my efforts. So good deal, I thought at the time. I officially joined, though, in 1995, and now have spent the last 3 decades working with B2B companies representing virtually every major market sector, and most of them, it turns out, family governed. I'm also the host of the Growing Up B2B podcast, where we've had the privilege now of speaking with over 120 leaders from family-owned or family-governed B2B companies or the advisors. So, as I mentioned, we've had 120 conversations through our podcast, and they've become really the foundation for today's presentation because they reveal many interesting insights about how enduring businesses create value. And they also revealed how important each leader's circle of trusted advisors was to the continuity of those organizations. So whether they were in the form of boards or advisory committees, sometimes they just refer to them as my team, referencing my team of advisors. One thing certainly became clear, that no leader walks alone. The advice, counsel, and direction that all of you provide are critical to the long-term success of that family-governed B2B organization. So you do important work. They count on you. They rely on you for the big decisions, and they turn to you when at their highest point of need. So one of the reasons that this topic personally resonates with me is that we live it every day. We are a second-generation family business ourselves. At the core, we're built here, and we're here to drive measurable and sustainable growth for the B2B organizations that we serve. And the number is probably the one I care most about on this sheet is really our longest client relationship spanning 33 years now. And that was originally started as a family-owned business, a father-son team, as well as our top 10 client relationships that are family-governed B2B of almost 11 years. So when I talk about being that advisor that is critical, that one can't replace, we too are trying to practice that ourselves with the clients we serve and trying to be indispensable to their needs as well. So here's the tension behind today's conversation. The amount of information available to your clients has exploded. AI can explain a tax concept, it can summarize a regulation, it could draft an agreement, analyze financial data, or even answer any sort of strategic question in seconds. So access to expertise is certainly changing. But what's interesting is the hardest part of leadership hasn't changed at all. Owners still have to make difficult decisions with incomplete information, conflicting priorities, and then there's family dynamics, emotion, risk, as well as consequences. And that's where trusted advisors matter, and that's where I'd say they matter most. When AI started accelerating, one of the questions we began asking ourselves was, does this ultimately make professional advisors less valuable? And after 120 conversations, we've actually come to the opposite conclusion. The advisors people talked about most positively weren't necessarily the people with the fastest answer. They were the people who helped them think differently about the problem, usually by asking bigger and better questions. And that's really the distinction that we're going to continue to explore today. So if I could, before I get into that, I'm just kind of curious as to what you think and where you're standing. So let me start the first poll question. So over the next 5 years, where do you believe the greatest value of a professional advisor is going to come from? Is it technical expertise, AI proficiency, industry specialization, better client relationships, strategic judgment, or possibly something else? I'll give everyone another couple of seconds to wrap it up. Okay. So fairly balanced, AI proficiency, better client relationships, and strategic judgment. So I'll share the results. Great. Thanks, everybody. So let's see how that stacked up with what we heard from about 120 conversations. When we started the Growing Up B2B podcast, so it was about 2 years ago now, the goal wasn't simply to produce another podcast. There's plenty of podcasts out there. We really saw it as an opportunity to learn what actually enables a family-governed business to survive, grow, and transition successfully. So the way we see it, joining a family business, and through my own experience, when you're a next generation leader, it's something of a calling, not unlike how some are called to the armed forces or medicine or other mission-driven pursuits. And each generation, subsequently, that answers that call is usually faced with a dramatically different set of circumstances and a changed world from the previous generation. So whenever I speak with what we call a deep gen executive, so that's 4 generations or deeper in their organization, I just have to think that that's really remarkable. That means that 4 or more individuals in that family lineage answered that call and had or developed the abilities required to take that business forward successfully to the next generation. That's pretty remarkable when you see that showing up. Very uncommon, and I think something to be appreciated and prized. So now having more than 120 of those conversations over that span, some clear patterns certainly emerged for us. We expected to hear a lot about succession, and we certainly did. But the conversations rarely started there. They often started around leadership, trust, culture, the professionalization of the organization, the identity of the organization, stewardship, or long-term thinking. And it turned out that this was an important insight, that succession is often the outcome of work in many different areas that started usually many years earlier. Only in extreme cases where either the previous generation had to step down or in some instances, sadly, passed away unexpectedly, did that succession process happen in a rush. And even in those circumstances, based on what we learned, there was already some preliminary groundwork and preparation that was in place. So it wasn't quite the rush. Still a traumatic and jarring event for the organization and that next gen leader. But nonetheless, they were on the ground. They knew enough. They had enough exposure to navigate successfully. And that's why I don't think AI diminishes the role of a great and trusted advisor. AI may certainly change how information gets delivered and accessed, but it doesn't eliminate the human conversations around trust, leadership, family relationships, difficult decisions, or growth. If anything, I think those conversations are becoming more valuable, not less. And AI is certainly influencing better and deeper questions than you can and should be asking, because your clients, they're now AI inspired. They're able to better ask. A lot of times you may notice this, that your clients are coming to the table armed with a lot more information, better questions themselves, sometimes laying down information, and you're wondering, where did that come from? Well, it probably came from AI. So getting into our interviews and what we've learned, 7 conversations just kept showing up. And I'm going to take you through these, not as 7 areas where you suddenly need to become an expert, but 7 areas where, as a trusted advisor, you should know how to effectively open up a conversation when the circumstances present themselves. So getting into the first, start with legacy. So legacy shapes decisions. A spreadsheet can certainly tell you what a business is worth, but it can't tell you what a founder believes the business is for, or what it means to them, or what it means to them to pass the business down to the next generation. And if you don't understand that, you can make a perfectly rational recommendation that the owner, quite honestly, will never accept. So rather than asking, what do you want to accomplish? Take the conversation deeper. What absolutely cannot change? What traditions still create competitive advantage? What do you hope the next generation never loses? Those are incredibly revealing questions in a family business, because sometimes the issue isn't resistance to a recommendation you might make. The issue is that your recommendation unknowingly threatens something that the owner or leadership or the family considers sacred. And in every family business, and I can even attest to this here, there are certain rules of the road, and there are certain what I'll call no-fly zones. Sometimes they're deliberately discussed openly, and sometimes those no-fly zones are unspoken. And it's often that unspoken sacred ground that you need to uncover to be of the greatest value and the greatest service to them. The things not so much that they are saying, but what they're not saying and what's living just beneath the surface that needs to be said. So once you ask, then it's important to start listening. What's underneath the answer? You're listening for identity, values, risk tolerance, and especially emotional anchors. Those things may never appear on a balance sheet or an operating plan or a legal document, but they most certainly can and do influence decision making, especially in a family governed organization. This changes how you make recommendations. If you know what the founder is trying to protect, you can help them see change not as abandoning the legacy, but as actually protecting the legacy for the future. And that's where legacy starts to transition into leadership and become leadership. One of the clearest lessons from our conversations was that succession actually starts much earlier than many people think. If the first serious leadership conversation happens when ownership is about to transfer, you and they are probably already too late. Future leaders need to be developing years before any sort of documentation or exchanging of shares ever occurs. And one of my favorite questions here is, who is learning how to make tomorrow's decisions today? Not watching decisions, not attending meetings, actually making decisions and then living with the consequences of those decisions. That's how true leadership capability develops. It's a sad sight, and I don't know if any of you have experienced it, but I certainly have, where you see an organization and you've got, maybe a next generation middle-aged executive, and he's wearing the president's hat. And you still see this older individual, an aging parent, possibly in their 80s, still wearing the CEO hat, still coming in every day and still making big decisions. That next generation, as a result, never actually gets the opportunity to truly feel and experience what it means to lead. And that's a shame, because when perhaps in their late 50s, that next gen leader is for the first time discovering that they may or may not have what it takes to move the organization forward. So it's really unfair to them to not have the opportunity to make decisions, to be involved with the big ones, to experience what it feels like to have those consequences, and to know what it truly means to lead. Many times we see that previous generation sticking around a little too long, and I'm not saying, hey, it's time to kick them out, but it's time to let the next generation truly lead. And that's what's going to bring the organization forward. So as advisors, we're listening for the gap between someone's position and their actual readiness. Are they trusted? Can they, as the next gen, make the hard decisions? Have they failed and recovered? That's often more informative than asking whether a formal succession plan exists or what one's title might be. So the larger point is simple. Great advisors are only involved when ownership changes. Along the way, there's an opportunity to help clients develop the people who will eventually be ready to lead and own it, whether it be a next gen transition or a transition to others. And we see that a lot too. A lot of times there is not that next generation leader in the family, and sometimes leadership goes to an outside individual, and the family remains on the board or in an advisory capacity. That happens quite often. So next question. Let me set this up. Just to kind of get an idea of who's in the room, what percentage of your clients are family owned or family governed? Okay. Give it another second. Okay. Thanks, everybody. So it looks like most about a quarter of your clientele, some are about half, and a couple more, and a few 100% or 76 to 100%. Let's share the results. All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay. So let's talk about the next conversation. Professionalization protects culture. Sometimes professionalization creates a little bit of a negative reaction in a family business. I know I experienced some friction as I was bringing professionalization into this organization. So sometimes people hear professionalization, they think bureaucracy. But when done correctly, professionalization isn't about replacing culture. It's about making sure the culture isn't dependent on two or three people remembering how everything works, what we often refer to as tribal knowledge. And that shows up a lot in the family governed organizations. As a second gen myself, and having hosted many fellow second gens on our show, it often falls on us to professionalize or modernize what the founding generation started, to develop those systems and processes, methods, quality controls, to ensure that there is a consistency of quality. So if you've been around Delia Associates long, you've heard me say, and my team's probably heard me say this 1,000 times, we execute with excellence. So if we're going to do something, we're going to do it to a level of excellence and not less. So that's one of the isms that I have. Here's a question that can elevate the professionalization discussion very quickly. If one key executive departed tomorrow, what breaks? Not because we want or we're expecting that to happen, but because it reveals where the organization is dependent on an individual rather than on a system. And when we're striving for resilience and continuity of prosperity, we don't want the organization to be crippled if a key executive departs or is unable to perform their duties. So this is especially important when that one person, and we see this sometimes too, happens to wear the CEO or president title, aka the founder-dependent organization. So it should not all reside with one person, should not all reside with the lead person. There should be systems and processes and methods in place to ensure that no matter what, that organization is set and geared to endure. So in professionalization, some things to listen for. Single points of failure. It's knowledge that's living in someone's head, or decisions maybe that only one person can make, or a concentration of customer relationships controlled by one individual. Those often are signs of invisible risks, or what I like to think of as like little ticking time bombs They're just lying in wait out there in the future until when something happens, they go off and it creates a big mess. So listen for those signals, listen for those little points of failure or bottlenecks that could potentially cripple the organization or make it really hard for that organization to move forward. And ultimately, the best systems, they don't sterilize a family's company culture. They don't make them vanilla. They actually make that culture transferable. And that's the distinction. We want to understand, identify, express, and extend that culture. And ideally, when it comes to a family governed enterprise, across as many generations as is possible. This one, obviously, it's close to home of all advisory relationships. So getting back to AI, from an AI can explain why trust matters, but it can't sit across the table from someone during a difficult moment and ultimately earn it. And in many family businesses, trust is one of the company's most valuable assets. So great questions to ask. Why have your best customers stayed? The first answer may be service, quality, or relationship, but keep digging. Eventually, you'll usually discover a pattern of promises that have been kept consistently over a long period of time. That's trust expressed in an operational manner. If possible, also listen for what others say about the company when people in that company aren't in the room. So what do they say when you're not around? Because that's reputation. So look at tenure, repeat business, referrals, situations where somebody gave them the benefit of the doubt. All signals of trust that the business often possess, but don't actively measure or ultimately express. Many organizations treat this idea of trust as something soft, but trust affects some very hard outcomes: customer retention, price sensitivity, referrals, decision speed, as well as employee loyalty. So part of our job as advisors is to help leaders recognize that trust is an asset worth understanding and protecting at all costs. This was one of the patterns that really stayed with me as we moved through some of our conversations. Because as I said before, we were kind of looking for succession stories in that journey, but what we repeatedly found were leadership stories, trust stories, professionalization stories, and communication stories. The companies that handled succession well generally hadn't solved succession at the last minute. They had built the conditions through all these other means for that succession many, many years earlier. So let's tee up another question here. What do you believe creates the greatest long-term competitive advantage for the businesses you advise? Culture right out of the gate, huh? Give another couple of seconds. Okay, we've got culture followed by leadership and reputation. Great. Share the results. Terrific. Okay. What's interesting about this question is that none of these advantages truly exist completely independently. Leadership certainly shapes the culture. Culture influences and shapes relationships, and then ultimately relationships will shape the ongoing and enduring reputation. So thank you for your participation on that one. So moving on. We heard a lot about growth in a lot of our conversations, but interestingly, the best businesses weren't simply trying to grow more. They were very clear about how they wanted to grow and also what kind of growth they didn't want. So one executive, who's kind of a comical fellow I spoke with, he was actually brought in from the outside in a leadership role to establish ultimately some order to a family business. So I asked him, I said, Ken, what was their biggest issue? He said it was simple. They lacked the ability to say no. Somebody came up with something. They were very entrepreneurial. They were very innovative minded. They wanted to try and do everything. And He said we had to come up with some systems to help them know when to say no. Know when they were getting out ahead of their skis, when they were going into uncharted waters that really were dangerous, that we had to get them a little bit reined in and teach them that, hey, sometimes it's okay to say no. So a really useful advisory question in that regard is, when you ask a CEO or a leader of a family governed business, what opportunities are you entertaining right now that just don't fit? We spend a lot of time asking companies what they do want, but sometimes more strategic clarity comes from defining what they're willing to or should be ultimately saying no to. Growth is often the result of this strategic discipline, and strategic discipline compounds. When you say no to a wrong fit customer, that ultimately protects the team. And that also allows you to serve all those right fit customers even better. That strengthens the reputation. And suddenly knowing when to say no becomes part of that growth strategy, knowing that, hey, this is not a fit. Let's not try to force the square peg in the circle hole. We know what happens when we do that. Let's stay away from that. Let's focus on what we're really good at and get even better at it, maybe become the best in class at it. So next communication set here is leadership is earned. This is particularly relevant in a family business. A title can be given, equity can be transferred, but the organization ultimately decides when somebody has the chops or the credibility to do the job. So a great question to ask is, how is that next generation earning credibility? Not how they're being introduced, but how are employees, customers, and other leaders in the company seeing evidence that this person is ready? Virtually all of the next gen leaders on our show started not at the top, but at the very, very bottom. So I was talking to one, I think it was a second gen, yeah. And I said, what was your first day on the job like? So he said, well, I did touch-up painting on the exterior of the building for the first week. So I said, well, why'd you do that? He said, well, that's the first job of every new employee. You start at the bottom no matter what. Even access in that organization, access through the front door actually had to be earned. You had to do some work, touch up paint on the exterior. And when you did that, you earned the right to come in the front door and start doing the real work, or at least getting access to it. And for what it's worth, they are not in the painting business, manufacturing company, not in the painting business. So I thought that was interesting. Everybody had the same rite of passage, family member or otherwise. Leadership is demonstrated before it's recognized. The best succession stories tend to look almost uneventful, honestly, from the outside, because by the time the title actually changes, the people have already in that organization already been following that next gen leader for years. That emerging leader, they've worked shoulder to shoulder with some of the people they will soon and now lead. They've put in the long hours. They've had those stressful moments. They've experienced the sleepless nights. They, and we all know this, have broken away from that family vacation to attend to an emergency. They've been active or on site on a Saturday, sometimes Sundays too. They have earned the respect through act and deed, not title. Title always comes later. For the best multi-gen business leaders, we found that it's always earned and never given. If anything, working under a parent can be harder. They tend to expect and demand more of you as their child than they might a non-family member. Because let's face it, they know you better than anyone. They know you to your core. They also know what you're capable of. So yeah, when you're a next gen, it is going to be harder on you, and you are going to be answering to, not only a boss, but also potentially a parent. And then of course we've got technology. So our view on this question isn't simply, can AI do this? Increasingly, the answer is going to be yes. The more important question is, should it? So that's where I think advisors can add enormous value. Where should technology remove friction? Where should it accelerate things? And where is the human relationship actually part of the value being delivered? Those are very different questions than, should we use AI? How should we use AI? Which tools should we use? Things like that. Those are tactical. my preferred test when it comes to this is simple. Does the technology make our people more capable, or does it simply make them less necessary? The best investments in technology amplify human judgment rather than blindly removing human involvement. And that's really our position on that. That said, we do give AI plenty of credit. We're heavily versed and immersed in AI ourselves as an organization and have been for several years. It's extraordinary at finding information, summarizing, drafting, analyzing patterns, accelerating research, and it's going to get better at all these things. It continues to do so. And at a very rapid pace, we're also moving from using this technology to learn and prompt to using the technology to actively create and do. We're going to see more and more functionality as people start to realize we can build this with AI, we can do this with AI, we can get a foothold with AI, and starting to really take it the next level, which is in that create and do mode. So now let's take a look at this list. Build trust, challenge assumptions, read emotion, create alignment, exercise judgment, help make a difficult decision. That's where extraordinary advisors live. And the more abundant information becomes, the more valuable these capabilities become. This may be the most practical idea that I'll leave you with today. A lot of times we hear a leader of a family business present a problem, but often it's not the real problem. Client says growth is stalled. An average advisor might just say, okay, let's start solving for growth. But a great advisor asks first, what changed? What changed? Did anything change in your strategic focus? Did anything change in the market? What changed? Client might say, hey, people are resisting change in the organization. Instead of explaining change management, what are the people afraid of losing? What are they afraid of? What are they scared of? That's the advisor's edge. It doesn't mean, hey, we immediately answer the question a client asks. We're not being difficult by not doing that, but ultimately, it's about helping them discover a potentially bigger question that they truly need to answer. And in answering that one, they solve for a bigger problem, or they solve for it permanently, or they solve it in a bigger way. And then they see you as the catalyst to listening and asking the bigger, the better, the tougher, the right question ultimately. So as those 120 plus conversations came together, we started to pull apart the key themes: legacy leadership, professionalization, trust, growth, leadership development, and technology. I'm not endorsing that you as advisors become an expert in all of these capacities. But if you advise family businesses, you should be comfortable enough to recognize when one of those conversations need to happen, and now have some of the tools to engage in a bigger, deeper, richer conversation that ultimately makes you, in their eyes, an indispensable advisor. So let's tee up the next poll question. Let me see. Okay. Okay. Poll question 4. Where do you think you create the most value for your clients today? Great. All right. So we got mix here: solving problems, making connections, challenging their thinking, and helping them make difficult decisions. Excellent. Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye. So the future of trusted advice is that in this age of AI, AI is going to keep getting better at answers. So trying to protect your value as an advisor by just knowing more answers is probably not a winning strategy. I think the opportunity today is to become the person who understands the business, understands the people, sees what others don't see, and asks the big questions that change, elevate, or challenge the conversation in a really, really powerful way. The future belongs to advisors who don't just provide answers. It belongs to the ones who improve decisions. And that, as I said, often begins with asking those bigger and better questions. And that's a little dumpy today. Okay. So one of the reasons that we've learned so much is that so many people have been incredibly generous about sharing their experiences and their knowledge on our program. So if you do advise family-governed businesses or know an owner, CEO, or next-gen leader whose story would be valuable, love to hear from you. It could be a multi-gen business, or it could be family members in business together, or even spouses working in partnership. The best conversations, by the way, aren't the perfect success stories. They're often the more complicated ones, the challenging ones. And while there may be common elements of our journey as next gens, after 120 episodes, I could tell you that every story is unique. We also greatly value your own experiences guiding and advising family businesses. So if you haven't been on our program yet and you think your expertise could bring value to our listenership, please reach out to me after the webinar and we'll see if we can book you for a future episode. We love hearing from the trusted advisor community because you bring such a great perspective, not just for one family business, but for many family businesses. And that's incredibly valuable for our listenership. So, and because, I wanted this episode to be useful beyond today, each of you are going to be receiving a practical discussion guide, the 21 executive questions every trusted advisor should ask. There are 3 questions tied to each of the 7 conversations we covered today. My suggestion when you consume this and take a look at it is, don't pull it out at your next meeting with a client and ask all 21. Pick one, or pick the one at the right moment that's most relevant. And then after you do so and ask that question, do the one thing that the best and most respected trusted advisors do. Stop talking and listen. So that's where I'd like to leave it. The future of professional advice isn't about competing with AI to see who can produce answers faster. It's about becoming more valuable in places where the answer alone isn't enough. Okay, thanks again, everyone. As I said, this will be coming to you by recording, as well as the download of the 21 great questions to ask. And all of our contact information is there. So if there is any follow-ups, always welcome to reach out to me. I'd love to talk with you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.